this is Misty Green, and you're listening to the I Lead Misty Blue podcast, where strategy meets soul and faith finds its voice. If you've been walking through Samson's story with me over the last two episodes, then you know we've taken the long way to Delilah, and we did that on purpose. In the drift before Delilah, we went back to the vineyard because, see, Samson's story didn't begin with just one catastrophic decision, as our Sunday school teachers tended to portray, which was Delilah. No, it actually began with Samson testing the guardrails of his purpose with proximity. We watched a man God set apart before birth slowly become comfortable walking near things God had placed clear guardrails around. We also discussed Samson's defeat over the lion, and later we watched Samson drift from the path to revisit his past victory, reach into the carcass, and tempt another guardrail by scooping honey from something dead. Samson kept it moving, though, and moved as though he hadn't defiled his own protected purpose, as if nothing had happened or even changed. Then, in the second part of the series, we stayed in the part of Samson's life that often gets skipped altogether. We followed him to Timnah and into a marriage his parents questioned. We watched Samson's desire become increasingly persuasive. We then discussed the riddle at the wedding feast, which led to outside pressure on his wife. And out of fear, we observed his wife betray Samson's confidence. We met Samson's rage and retaliation through the foxes and the violence and 1,000 Philistines killed with the jawbone of a donkey. We then saw God meet Samson where he was and quench his physical thirst after the retaliatory battle. We saw God provide water when Samson could provide nothing for himself. Then Samson went to Gaza. He slept with a prostitute. And while the men surrounded him, waiting to kill him, Samson somehow exited the situation unscathed, moved to the entrance of the city, and ripped the gates of the city straight from the ground. He put them on his shoulders and walked away. What a symbol of pride. Again and again, Samson survived. Samson seemed unharmed, and his purpose appeared unaltered. That word again matters. Again, Samson survived. Again, the strength was there. Again, the thing that should have slowed Samson down somehow became another story about what he was capable of overcoming. And by the time we arrive at Delilah, we're no longer meeting the young man who simply walked too close to a vineyard. We're meeting a man who has spent years surviving the consequences of his own decisions. He's learned that lions, they can be defeated, ropes can be broken, and enemies can be overthrown. We even observed how gates can be yanked and destroyed. And Samson learned that even when his own desires lead him to danger, he can find his way back to comfort and safety. I imagine those types of experiences can really do something to a person, to a human. When you've been strong and capable for so long, you start to assume your own strength and your own abilities will always be enough. And when consequences have been delayed, you can start believing they're never coming. See, Samson had not stopped being gifted or purposed just because he was living within his own desires. No, He'd simply experienced enough moments surviving himself without any consequences. And it would seem he had stopped believing anything could truly overpower him. It's then and only then that scripture introduced Delilah. Isn't that interesting? I don't know about you, but I spent over 3 decades attending church regularly, and I never learned about Samson's journey to self reliance. I only ever truly learned about Delilah and how she tricked him. Isn't that interesting? Her introduction is almost surprisingly simple and underplayed. See, Samson falls in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek named Delilah. We're not told how they met. We don't know what first attracted him to Delilah. We don't know how long they knew each other or what their relationship looked like before the Philistine rulers became involved. Scripture simply tells us that Samson loved Delilah. And that one detail is important because Samson's relationship with Delilah is different from some of the relationships we've already seen. The text actually tells us, it specifies he loved her, not just that he saw her and wanted her, not just that he desired her, but that he loved her. The Philistine rulers apparently knew enough about the relationship to understand that Delilah had a unique access to Samson, one that other people didn't. So they approached Delilah with an offer. Each ruler promised her 1,100 pieces of silver if she could discover the source of Samson's great strength and tell them how he could be subdued. They're not asking her to learn something trivial. No, they wanted the secret behind Samson's strength. They wanted to know Samson's vulnerability. They wanted the one piece of information that would allow them to do what armies and ropes and ambushes and city walls had failed to do. They wanted to know how to make Samson weak. And what did Delilah do? She agreed. I really wish that scripture gave us more about that specific moment because there are so many questions I would ask. Did she hesitate? Had she loved him at all? Was the money enough to make the decision simple for her? Had the Philistines already been part of her world in ways that Samson didn't understand? And who was Delilah before Samson? So before Samson and Delilah ever united, who was this woman? What was her character? We aren't told any of these details that may make all of this more clear. No, instead, we're simply given a front seat to what happens next. Delilah asks Samson a question that is so direct, there's almost no way to misunderstand it. Tell me the secret of your great strength. Tell me how you can be subdued. That's what she asks Samson. Notice the language. She isn't asking how he exercises or maintains his strength. She's not asking what makes him physically powerful. She asks specifically, how can you be subdued? How can someone restrain you? How can someone overpower you? How can someone make you unable to fight back? See, Samson hears the question from Delilah and he answers. He doesn't tell her the truth, though. He tells her that if he were tied with 7 fresh bowstrings that had never been dried, he would become as weak as any other man. The Philistine rulers bring Delilah exactly what Samson had described, the materials needed to subdue him: 7 fresh bowstrings. And what does she do? She ties them up with them. And there are men who are hiding nearby. Then Delilah cries out, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." Samson snaps the bowstrings as easily as threads break, when they're touched by a fire. He's free. The secret of his strength remains hidden, but something else is no longer hidden. Delilah asks Samson how he could be restrained. Samson gave her an answer. She immediately tried it. That's not a feeling of intuition. That is an actual event. Samson didn't need discernment to determine what had happened. No, he experienced it in real time. If somebody asks you how to destroy you, and then shortly afterward, you wake up surrounded by the exact thing you told them would take you over, you don't need a spiritual gift to recognize that something's wrong here. No. There are so many times in my own life I can relate to this very moment of Samson's life. See, Samson knew maybe he didn't know everything, but he knew enough to know Delilah wasn't safe. Maybe he didn't know how much money was involved. He didn't know what she had bartered. Maybe he didn't know the details of the conversations that took place when he wasn't present, but he knew enough to understand that the information he gave Delilah, that it had been used against him, and yet he stayed. That's where this story becomes much more interesting to me than the simple version of Delilah tricked Samson that I was taught in Sunday school. Because after the first attempt, what did Samson do? Samson's no longer completely unaware. No, no, no. He has information about the character of Delilah. He has that now. And then Delilah tells him that he has done what? He's mocked her and he's lied to her. And she asked again, how could he be bound? And what did he do? He didn't walk away. He didn't reprimand her. He didn't question her. He gave her another answer. This time he says that if he's tied securely with new ropes that have never been used, he will become as weak as any man. So what does Delilah do? Yep, she gets the ropes. She ties Samson up. The men are there again, and she says the exact same thing. The Philistines are upon you, Samson. Again, he awakes. Samson breaks the rope, and again, he's free. For me, I'm wondering what's really happening in Samson's brain. Like, what is he thinking? What is he processing? And scripture doesn't tell us that. I'm wondering, did they have an argument? Did he laugh at her? Did Delilah attempt to explain away? Did she gaslight him? What was happening? Did she tell him it was a game? Did Samson know the Philistines had been waiting nearby? See, we don't get those details, and I don't want to create something that scripture doesn't give us, but my brain can't help but to wonder. I guess what we do know is enough. The relationship, it continued. That fact alone is remarkably strange to me. Twice, this woman who he loved has asked him for the information that would in fact make him vulnerable. And twice, Samson lied. And twice, Delilah has taken his lie and acted on it. And twice, Samson stayed close enough for another conversation. I think a lot about the relationships in our own lives where we already have the information. Not assumptions, not intuition, not discernment, but information, factual evidence. We know how the person handles our vulnerability because we've watched them handle it time and time again through a pattern. We know what happens when we tell them something private because we've experienced their betrayal or what they do with that information. We know the conversation always seems to end the exact same way. We know the apology. We know that there's going to be an explanation that comes. We know that there's going to be followed by maybe a promise for change behavior or even avoidance. And then eventually, what happens? The pattern repeats itself. Yet there's something about desire that can keep hope alive long after evidence has begun showing us something different. We tell ourselves this time might be different. We explain what happened in a way that allows us to process it and stay. We create excuses and we glorify the past. We accept a version of the story that hurts less than the truth. And sometimes we even ask God for another sign when what we really want is for the signs we already have to change their meaning. What does Delilah do? She asked this man a third time. And she says again to Samson, "You've mocked me." And she wants to know how he can be subdued, how he can be bound. This time, something changes in the answer, though. Pay close attention. The first answer was about bowstrings, and the second one was about ropes. Neither one was anywhere near the truth, but the third answer gets closer. This is where proximity from the first episode, The Drift, this is where it comes into play. Samson tells Delilah that if the 7 locks of his hair are woven into a loom, then he will become weak. His hair has now entered the conversation. He's not told her the truth yet, but he's moved steps closer. And that progression feels oddly familiar in Samson's reality. Rarely do we hand someone everything all at once. No. Sometimes the trust is lost in the same way the drift happens. The trust is lost gradually over time. Rarely is it one catastrophic event or moment. See, we move a little bit closer. We reveal a little bit more. We give a tad bit more access, a little bit more access than has even been earned, because we want the relationship more than we want to acknowledge what the relationship has already shown us. And the guardrail, what did it do? It moved a few inches, then a few more. And eventually, like Samson, we find ourselves much closer to the thing we once promised ourselves we would protect. Delilah takes Samson's hair and she weaves it into the loom while he sleeps. Oh, this woman. Then she wakes him again. The Philistines are upon you, Samson. Oh, this man. Samson jumps up, pulls free, and he walks away from the trap for the third time. The third question, the third answer, the third attempt, and now 3 escapes. This is where I think Samson's history becomes it starts to kind of work against him. Remember the man we met in the last episode? Samson has spent years overcoming. He has spent years acting in his own ways and escaping. He escaped the lion. He escaped the consequence surrounding the wedding feast, the riddle. He escaped the Philistines who came after him. He escaped the bowstrings. He escaped the ropes. He defeated 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. He even escaped Gaza. He pulled the entire city gate out of the ground and simply carried it away as if it were nothing. Now, he's escaped Delilah, not once, but 3 times. At some point, repeated escape can become its own kind of deception. Not because the danger is less real, but because you have become so accustomed to surviving it that you, me, we no longer believe it has the power to hurt us. Samson may have thought he was playing with Delilah. But I really wonder whether he was actually playing with his own sense of being invincible. See, he knew the answer and she didn't. He knew where the real line was. She didn't. He knew the guardrail. She didn't. Maybe that's what made him feel safe or even superior. And maybe he thought that as long as he stayed one step ahead of her, he still could control the outcome or the narrative. He had power over the situation. And there's a kind of pride that doesn't sound quite like arrogance. No, it sounds like, I know what I'm doing. I can handle this. I've seen this before. I know how far to take it. I know what's actually too far. And I'm going to leave before it gets to that place. And then one day you realize you've spent so much energy managing the edge that you stopped asking why you were still standing there to begin with. See, Delilah doesn't stop. Scripture says she pressed, and I think that word is so important. She pressed Samson day after day. Some versions even say she nagged him. Her words were wearing on him until he became sick of her questioning. That phrase changes the way I read what comes next. Samson doesn't tell Delilah the truth because Delilah suddenly proves that she's trustworthy. No, she hadn't done that yet. She doesn't apologize and spend months demonstrating that she's had changed behavior. No, that the pattern doesn't improve. The evidence doesn't even become more reassuring. Nothing about Delilah's character or behavior has earned her access to the truth. However, Samson tells her because he is worn down. And there's a particular kind of exhaustion that can make you feel like surrender is peace. You can get tired of having the exact same conversation over and over again. You can become exhausted by defending yourself, you can become tired and overwhelmed and exhausted by carrying specific betrayals, of saying no. You can become exhausted by explaining the guardrails to your life, tired of someone asking why the guardrails even exist to begin with. You can become tired of the tension that comes from protecting something when the person beside you keeps asking for access to it. Eventually, you can start believing that giving in will finally make everything quiet and you can just move on from this particular situation. That doesn't make it safe. See, Samson finally told Delilah the truth. And that time, he didn't simply tell her about his hair. No, he tells Delilah about his life. He tells her that no razor has ever touched his head because he has been a Nazarite set apart by God from his mother's womb. That is intimate disclosure. That is the epitome of vulnerability. For the first time in these three other conversations, Samson is not merely describing a physical weakness. No, he's telling her about his consecration. He's sharing his history. He's discussing his purpose and his calling. He gives Delilah access to the most intimate parts of himself. And he tells her about what has marked him since before he was born. He tells her that if his head is shaved, his strength will leave him and he will become like any other man. Delilah recognized that something was different. And she immediately sent word to the Philistine rulers, "Come back. He's told me the truth." What did they do? They returned with the money. Then Samson lay down to rest and he placed his head in Delilah's lap. Can you imagine that image? The strongest man in the story is asleep in the lap of a woman who has betrayed him not once, but 3 times before. He's resting in the lap of someone who has demonstrated she is untrustworthy with his vulnerability. There's something painfully human about that picture because sometimes the places where we feel most comfortable aren't necessarily the places where we're the safest. Sometimes intimacy creates a sense of safety that evidence and pattern has not actually earned. We relax because we love. We rest because we really want to believe and hope. We lower the guard because we're tired of holding on to the defense. And while Samson slept, 7 locks from his head were cut the 4th time. But it's different from the first 3 The first time, Samson lied about the bowstrings. The second time, he lied about the ropes. The third time, he moved closer to the truth and brought his hair into the conversation. The fourth time, he gave Delilah the one thing she had been asking for all along. He gave her the truth, and she does exactly what the pattern has already told him she would do with it. Then she says the words again. The Philistines are upon you, Samson. Samson awakes. And scripture gives us one of the most sobering moments of Samson's life. See, he thinks he's going to go out and shake himself free as he has before. I mean, why would he expect anything else? Everything else in history has taught him that he gets out of situations, that he escapes. The vineyard didn't stop him. The carcass didn't stop him. Timnah didn't hinder him. The Philistines didn't overtake him. Ropes couldn't stop and hold him. 1,000 men didn't stop him. Gaza didn't impact him and overtake him. The city gates didn't stop him. Delilah's first attempt didn't stop him. Neither did her second or third. He wakes up expecting history to repeat itself, but scripture says Samson didn't know that the Lord had left him. I can't think of many sentences in scripture that are more haunting than that one. Not because God had been hiding from Samson, because Samson had become so accustomed to the strength being there that he apparently expected access to it regardless of how casually he treated what had been entrusted to him. How human is that? And that's where this story becomes larger than Samson and Delilah. It becomes a story about the danger of assuming that what has always carried us will continue carrying us while we repeatedly move away from the things that kept us aligned. It becomes a story about confusing grace with permission. This becomes a story about how desire can override discernment without even erasing it, how it can override patterns. See, Samson had information. He had evidence. He had intuition. He had discernment. He had history. He had patterns. He had 3 different rehearsals before the final betrayal. What he didn't do was honor what he knew. That's why I don't think the most important question in this chapter is how could Samson not see what Delilah was doing? No, that's not the most important question. I think he saw plenty. The harder question is why seeing it wasn't enough to make him leave. And I think if we're being honest, that question belongs to all of us. Why do we stay after the pattern has become clear? Why do we keep explaining what someone has repeatedly demonstrated as hurting us? Why do we keep giving them the satisfaction of that explanation? Why do we call another warning confusing when the truth, it was simply painful? It's not confusing, it's simply hard to accept. Why do we believe the 4th conversation will produce something different than the first 3 couldn't produce? Maybe sometimes the answer is hope or love or loneliness or pride or ego. Maybe it's familiarity. Sometimes the reality is the fear of starting over can keep you in places you shouldn't be. Sometimes we've invested so much into a relationship or a career, a title, a role, a friendship, a dream, or even an identity that accepting what we now know feels like admitting that what we wanted is not what we actually have, or that what we gave didn't render the results that we want. So we stay. And sometimes, like Samson, we simply believe we can survive it and we can change it. That may be the piece that connects all 3 of these episodes for me. The drift taught Samson how to live close to the guardrail. His repeated victories taught him to trust his own strength. And Delilah exposed what happens when those 2 things finally meet. See, proximity had become normal, and pride had made him confident, and desire gave him a reason to stay. Discernment kept speaking through evidence that Samson kept overriding and dismissing. That's how a man strong enough to defeat armies ends up powerless in a room with one woman. Not because he wasn't physically stronger than her, because strength was never the only thing Samson needed. There's another part of this story, though I don't want to rush past it because the story doesn't end with Samson's strength disappearing. The Philistines do capture Samson. They blind him and they bind him. The man who once said a Philistine woman was right in his eyes eventually loses his sight entirely. That detail deserves its own conversation. So does the hair, because when Samson's hair begins to grow again, the Bible isn't telling us that magic is returning to his head. Something much deeper is happening. We've spent 3 episodes watching the drift, the pride, and the appetite of desire. We've watched the revenge, the proximity, the warnings. We've even observed the deception, and finally, the collapse. Next time, we'll talk about what remained after all of that was stripped away. Because the strength was never in the hair. Perhaps Samson had to lose everything he thought made him powerful before he could finally understand where his strength had come from all along. This is Misty Green, and you've been listening to the I Lead Misty Blue podcast, where strategy meets soul and faith finds its voice.